I want to pose a question to you. In 1999, NASA launched a spacecraft called the Mars Climate Orbiter. It was a $327 million mission, or $500 million in Australian dollars, and it took years of planning, thousands of engineers, and it was meticulously planned for. The spacecraft traveled for 9 months across 460 million miles of space, and then on September 23rd, 1999, just as it was about to enter the Mars orbit, it just vanished. It was lost forever. And now here's my question to you. When did the mission fail? Was it in those final moments when the spacecraft entered the atmosphere at the wrong angle? Was it during the journey as small errors accumulated along the way? Or was it before launch in the architecture of the mission itself? I want you to commit to your answer right now because I want to show you something about your own goals and why they disappear the same way that the spacecraft did. And not in a moment of dramatic failure, but through a process so gradual that no one notices until it is too late. Hi, I'm John Angheli, the Motivation Maverick, and this is AccuMeets. We help busy creatives turn plans into proof, not with hype, with an execution OS. Subscribe for practical ideas that you can use today. Now, I had a client, let's call him Marcus, and he sat across from me in his work polo, coffee going cold, and said something that I've heard many times since. Look, I can't point to a single moment when I decided not to do this. I never said I quit or anything like that, but the goal just evaporated. It slipped away from me. Now, Marcus had a plan to open a 4th location for his own business. He'd mapped out the territory, the financing, the timeline, and set for himself about 6 months to launch. But 18 months later, it had not happened. In fact, it hadn't even started. Now, when I first began this work, I had a simple explanation for situations like this. You know, the usual motivation talk that you hear everywhere about discipline or focus or willpower and so on. I thought that it's just that Marcus got distracted, he lost motivation, and he gave up. Because it is a story that makes sense, right? It's a story that most of us tell ourselves. But the only problem is that it's mostly wrong. Because here's what didn't fit. Marcus was not lazy. He was working harder than ever. Every day he had a schedule filled with decisions, solving problems, extinguishing fires. He didn't drift because he stopped moving. He drifted while moving at full speed. Now, to understand what happened to Marcus, we need to go back to that spacecraft analogy. Now, when a spacecraft travels to Mars, it doesn't fly in a straight line. It cannot. There are gravitational pulls from other planets, for instance. There's solar wind, tiny imperfections in the trajectory itself. Left alone, even the most perfectly aimed spacecraft will inevitably drift off course. So NASA builds in something called trajectory correction maneuvers. There are regular checkpoints where they measure the actual position against the intended position, and then they make adjustments. The Mars Climate Orbiter had all these checkpoints built in, but there was one problem. One engineering team was sending navigation data in metric units, in other words, in meters or kilometers, and another team's software, they were using imperial units. They were using feet and miles. The numbers looked reasonable enough, so no one really caught the discrepancy between the two. As such, at each checkpoint, the spacecraft was slightly off. Yes, the corrections were made, but they were slightly wrong, and so these errors started compounding. And by the time it reached Mars, the spacecraft was 170 kilometers lower than intended. And so it entered the Martian atmosphere, and it burned up in the process. Now, here is what I find remarkable about all this. The spacecraft was always working. The engines always fired. The solar panels were working properly. They were charging. The computers also ran efficiently. And so from the inside of the spacecraft, everything was looking very fine. But the failure wasn't in the spacecraft itself. It was in the system that was supposed to catch the drift itself, which was badly set up. Now, this is exactly what happens with our own goals in real life. We're moving, we're productive, we're working hard, but without the right checkpoints, without systems that make drift visible, we end up somewhere that we never intended to go. And there are 4 forces that researchers have observed that make this process of drift almost inevitable. We have the first force, or the trap of optimism. Now, when Marcus built his 6-month timeline, I asked him, how long did your last expansion take? It took him, in actuality, about 11 months. And the one before that, I asked him, well, it was something like 14 months. And so, why did you then estimate that this one was going to take you 6 months instead? He paused and replied, well, I thought this time it would go smoother. I'd done this process a few times already. Now, this is what researchers call the planning fallacy. We build timelines not on how things actually go, but based on how we imagine things may hopefully go. And when reality compresses an optimistic timeline like this, then something has to give. And it is usually the goals that have the furthest deadline in view. Now, Marcus's trajectory was way off before he even launched. The 6-month estimate that he gave himself, it was almost guaranteed that he'd be fighting against himself from week 1. The drift was already baked into the plan. And then we have force number 2, the reward mismatch. And you can try this for yourself with a simple thought experiment. Imagine you are at your desk and imagine you have just 2 hours to work on a certain task. Okay? Now, you could work on a strategic project that will really pay off in about 8 months' time, or you could clear 47 emails from your inbox and end the day with a clean and empty inbox. Which one do you think feels better to do? We all know this one, right? Because your brain releases a small reward every time you complete something. So you have now the opportunity to have 47 small little completions versus 0 with the strategic task which was ahead. So the strategic project loses before it even starts simply because its finishing reward is invisible from the point of view of today. Marcus did have a habit of choosing small completions like we all do. And this wasn't because he was weak or had a character flaw, anything like that. It's simply because that's how our nervous system is wired up. And this is what researchers call the reward mismatch. Now at play, there's also force number 3, the force of hidden costs. There is a principle in life that we would be wise to remind ourselves most often. Every time you say yes to something, you are automatically saying no to something else. Always. And here is the problem. The yes is very vivid, crisp and clear. And the no, what you are not doing instead, is mostly invisible. It's mostly out of our conscious awareness, right? So when Marcus took on a prestigious corporate client a few months after that he set this goal for himself, he saw the contract value, he saw the potential of a new power relationship, he estimated the associated prestige in completing that project, but what he could not see in the same vivid way was the 12 weeks of attention that this new opportunity was going to take from him, the project he said yes to, and how this would in fact be extracting from his prior plan. The trade-off was real, but only one side of it was visible. He only saw the upsides of a new corporate undertaking and not the downsides and how this would impact all his other goals. And you can't navigate the trade-offs when you can't see that you are actually making them. And then there's force number 4, the issue of missing checkpoints, or the one force that ties all these issues together. This is the spacecraft equivalent of the unit conversion era that we mentioned earlier. Marcus never really had a routine, an established habit where he could regularly and habitually review, is my actual behavior today aligned with my prior stated priorities? Marcus had weak and vague moments when he would measure these checkpoints. As such, he had little leverage to undertake trajectory correction maneuvers, as NASA would put it. He had not set up for himself dependable routines where the gap between his intentions and his actions would become visible. And so the gap grew ever wider. It expanded week by week, decision by decision, until one day he looked up and the goal he sought after was really out of sight. Now let's consider once more the question that we started with. When did Marcus actually abandon his original goal? Well, it was not when one of his workers quit, for instance, nor when the corporate client presented him with a new opportunity, nor when the daily fires consumed his ordinary attention. We could argue that Marcus almost abandoned the accomplishment of this goal by week 1, before any of those events or opportunities even happened. Why? Because Marcus built a plan that did not account for reality, for what actual life is truly like. He had no system to make his trade-offs visible. He had no checkpoints to catch the inevitable drift that is part of all of our lives. He just left the gap between his intentions and his actions unexamined. And yet the events that seemed like causes, they were actually just like gravitational pulls in outer space. Marcus's spacecraft was left mostly unsteered, and so the drift was already baked in, as it were. It was inevitable, and it was bound to happen. In short, here's what this means. Drift is not a character problem. It is mostly a design problem. Marcus was certainly not weak-willed. He was simply operating in a system where the forces of drift were quite strong, and he did not set up the correction mechanisms that were needed to counter these drifting forces. And the same is true for most of us. So what did Marcus end up doing? Well, he rebuilt his operating system in the same way that the NASA program rebuilt theirs after the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster. First, he started planning from evidence and not from wishful thinking. Before committing to any timeline, Marcus would look at how long similar projects actually took, and not how long he would prefer or hoped that they would take. He learned to counter his optimism bias, or for that matter, our optimism bias, from the outside view of actual reality rather than our inner view of wishful thinking or wishful fantasy. And the second thing, Marcus got into the habit of making trade-offs clear and visible. Before taking on anything new, he had to name what he would inevitably have to stop or to reduce in quantity or quality as to accommodate for this new thing. Third, Marcus had to learn to protect his best, most strategic time. So 2 mornings per week, he had no phone, no email, no internet at all. As such, no interruptions and no trivial temptations to go to. He simply set aside time for when the spacecraft of his life could travel without any gravitational interference. He set time for focused arrival on target. And fourth, and most important, Marcus built in a set of habitual and regular checkpoints. Once a week for minor adjustments, once a month for major adjustments, once a quarter for systemic adjustments, and yearly review as to ground his life upon the values that matter the most. He set up ahead of time for recalibration and for examining the gap between his stated priorities and his actual allocation of time. So whenever and wherever drift appeared in all of his life aims, and they inevitably appear because this is just the nature of life, Marcus was able to catch it in time. He could do it now in days, not months, not years. As such, the goal he set up for himself to open up the 4th location, he got it accomplished in about 14 months thereafter. And it was not because Marcus became a different person, it's simply because he built now for himself an execution operating system. So if we return again to the opening question with which we started, when did the Mars Climate Orbiter mission actually fail? Well, the most complete answer is it happened before launch. It was in the architecture of the project. It was in the missing protocols that would have caught the unit conversion error. It was in the assumption that everything would work out just as planned, when drift in life is in fact inevitable. And so the spacecraft was destroyed in the blink of a moment, and yet the failure was distributed across hundreds of smaller and smaller decisions beforehand, where each one seemed reasonable, and yet where each nudge took it way off course. And our goals work much in the same way. And our tendency to drift isn't just happening when we feel overwhelmed or when we feel distracted. It's probably happening right now. Because if there is a gap between what you say that matters most to you and where your time actually goes right now, then drift is at play. So that is why we need to have checkpoints built into our calendars to name the trade-offs in what we are choosing right now. And the good news is that this better architecture can be fully built, and the spacecraft of your life can reach Mars. But only if you make the decision to consciously steer your week, to steer your month, to steer your quarter, your year in tune with your higher vision. Carpe diem.